Good afternoon, everybody. I'm chairing the debate this afternoon, which is actually the morning for two of our debaters. And as you can read in your swap card, the motion is quite complicated, and it says, this House believes universities in their current form are unsustainable as mass participant institutions. Every word matters, and every word may be fought over by our proposers and opposers. Just for the record, my name is Paul Baksich. I'm the founder and CEO of the online learning consultancies Matic Media and Dualversity, as well as involved in 4 companies offering education and training online services. So possibly one might deduce where my thoughts might lie. I'm also professor of practice at the University of the West Indies Open Campus, where it's pretty early in the morning at the moment. And of course, I used to go there for 2 weeks every semester. That was then, and this is now. Maybe we'll get back to that sooner we hope. Our debaters are a challenging group, carefully chosen word, ready to challenge your preconceptions and challenge each other. And my role is to ensure a lively but fair debate. Fair within the rules of debate. Fairness is often in the eye of the beholder. So just for the record, the motion we have two to propose. Brian Mulligan, based in Ireland. I'm just giving you the geography lesson as we go along. Always get extra services from me. He's head of online learning innovation in the Centre for Online Learning at the Institute of Technology, Sligo. And he is a leader in online distance learning in Ireland, initiating it in the country's largest provider, which is his own provider, in 2002. Donald Clark is based in the UK, and he's CEO and director of lots of things, Wildfire Learning and several other e-learning companies, but perhaps best known, people might say, as the author of the Plan B Learning blog, where you get a kind of different view on things you thought were decided. Excellent read. And he's also a visiting professor at the University of Derby, which is a role actually I have as well. So we do have some common interests and activities. And then against the motion, we have Mary Sini, based in the US, so quite early, I think. She's Chief Strategy Officer at Ed2Work and former President of the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, as well as Provost Emerita of UMUC, the University of Maryland Global Campus, which is very well known to many of you, I'm sure. And finally, we have Jane Bozarth, also based in the US. She's an online training solutions specialist and author and director of research for the Learning Guild. And she describes herself, and you can look at the CV to see it, as a veteran classroom trainer who transitioned to e-learning in the late 1990s and has never looked back. So don't psychoanalyze the CVs too much to see what side of the debate people are on. You might get a surprise. And you can read more about them in their CVs. Now, we're just about to start the debate, and I'll give a signal in a minute. The running order, which is long-standing Oxford tradition, followed by Online Educa in Berlin, changing countries quickly. The order is Brian to start off the supporting the motion, then Marie, then Jane, and then Donald to close for the supporting side. And they have 7 minutes each. We'll see how it goes. I do know somebody who has control of the mute button, so please keep to time. That's really about the only restriction, just keep to time. And after the speeches, there'll be a discussion, and with 15 minutes to go, we'll start the voting. It's a bit like Strictly Come Dancing for those that know that dreadful UK program, which is available in many other countries too, I gather, which is even worse news. At 5 to the hour, I'll announce the results and thank people, then close the debate. And that's enough mechanical stuff from me because you want to hear from the debaters. And so I'll hand over to Brian Mulligan to support the motion and start the debate. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Paul. Hi, everyone. As we've limited time, I'll just get stuck in now. So who would have thought that engineers would come up with such a lovely phrase as graceful degradation, if I could say it, which is for lowering the quality of a digital service when transmission conditions are poor. Now, I'd like to suggest that universities should gracefully degrade and focus on new knowledge creation and dissemination, and restricting access to an elite, the brilliant and the curious. And the rest of us should just be satisfied with vocational education. Now, to make my point, I'll tell you a bit about myself rather than quote research to you. Now, apart from being skeptical about the quality of much of the research on higher education, there's very little being done to explore the value of higher education to society. And we won't mention the earning potential of degree holders, which seems to confuse correlation with causation. So it looks like I may be one of the few uneducated people around here because all my degrees are in engineering. I had to read Ulysses and David Hume on my own. Sorry, Finnegan's Wake and critical theory were just too impenetrable for me, but I'm not really sure a university course would have helped that much anyway. Now, I studied engineering in Dublin in the 70s. So between not having much money and classes from 9 to 5, I didn't get to spend much time with my classmates, developing a deep understanding of life, the universe, and everything. Although I did listen to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy faintly on BBC Radio 4. And yet I turned out to be a relatively productive member of society, as well as a well-balanced adult. Just ask any of my friends now. After 5 years of working as an engineer, I decided to give up being a productive member of society, and I became a lecturer and started a 36-year stretch of work teaching, doing a little bit of research, but mostly working with education technologies. Now, none of which I was qualified to do. And you know, I managed well enough. So here are a few conclusions I came to based on my experiences. Now, first, there are better ways to learn than attending university. Noticing how fast our online adult learners in the workplace learned, I realized that you learned something much more quickly if it was related to your work. Secondly, you don't need a degree to be competent at something. Now, when I realized that you could teach yourself most of what you might need for a job, but that employers were more willing to hire kids with degrees than kids who were self-taught, I began to see it as an expensive selection process. Now, Brian Kaplan describes it very well as signaling. Now, in biology, you see this in mate selection, for example, the well-known The Peacock's Tail, or maybe men playing football, or maybe owning Apple products. Now, being good at advanced mathematics mightn't get you a girlfriend. I had to teach myself to play guitar to do that, but it might get you a job, even if you never use the mathematics. Now, my third observation was, you don't need to go to university to develop critical thinking skills. Now, and I believe there is some research that suggests that universities don't even do that very well. Now, I've also heard many academics say that university education is an important coming of age experience. Now, I told my brother, who didn't go to university, that he wasn't as roundly developed as me. Now, I know you're dying to know what he said. Of course, I never said that. Even if I believed it, I'm not that stupid. Sure, don't I have a university education? So why does this matter? Well, cost for a start. So even if we could make it better, it still costs too much. Between climate change and an older population in the developed world, we may have other things that we need to spend our money on in the future. Higher education needs to be both better and cheaper. And this is not to mention even the opportunity cost of kids going to university who might be doing something more useful. And there's this. Universal higher education is supposed to level the playing field, but the desire of most institutions to be academically selective actually decreases social mobility. Now, we're not talking about 0.5% at the top. We're talking about the 30%, the middle classes who can afford whatever their kids need to get them into good universities and survive there. State support of higher education is essentially a subsidy for the middle classes, a subsidy that they believe will ensure that their kids remain in the middle classes. Now, it doesn't always work. So can we make universities better? Well, a colleague once said to me, higher education changes one retirement at a time. Now, I can't afford to take such a negative view because this has been my job for the last 25 years, to make my institution better through the use of learning technologies ago. But 20 years ago, I abandoned my efforts to improve quality efficiency in campus education. I changed my focus into improving access. Most of my colleagues weren't that interested in the potential of technology to improve their campus teaching. online distance learning was a greenfield site where we were free to innovate. Now, I became convinced that we all learn better when we're trying to do stuff, like in a job. So now I'm back working on campus education, and I'm trying to develop project-based degrees. But to be honest with you, I feel that projects in university are expensive artificial substitutes for real work, and that I'm just pandering to the desire to keep campus-based higher education relevant. Now, I've separately developed a work-based degree where the students go straight from second-level education into the workforce, and I think this will be better. But again, I wonder, is this avoiding the most important question? Are universities the right vehicle for what we're trying to achieve? So even if we agree that post-secondary education needs to be more than just vocational, okay, can we afford this expensive way to provide this for everyone? Asking universities to change reminds me of the old joke. How many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Yeah, that's right. Just one, but the light bulb has to want to change. And I'm not sure this particular light bulb does want to change. So I'll just leave you with a few lines from my favorite jazz composer, Leonard Cohen. Now, it doesn't actually represent my position, but I'm always reminded of these lines when we discuss this. I'm in the last few years of my career trying to improve higher education, but I'm wondering if it's a lost cause. Do we need something different? Shrink universities down and leave them to the brilliant and the curious and provide something else for the rest of us. So they sentenced me to 20 years of boredom for trying to change the system from within. I'm coming to reward them. First we take Manhattan, then we take OEB Berlin. Looking forward to next year. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. Excellent and excellent timekeeping. Now we move directly on to Marie, who is going to oppose the motion.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks for getting us started, Brian. Look, today's debate is about universities in their current form. This is when we start parsing words. Let me start by saying up front that I've spent a career in higher ed as an innovator and online and accelerated model expert. So I'm not a typical apologist for universities. But we shouldn't and simply can't conclude that universities are unsustainable as mass participant institutions, especially at a time when we need more knowledge and education for people than ever. Despite COVID, this is a terrible moment, but people are living longer lives. They're facing longer periods of time in their jobs and their careers. They have to learn how to adapt to major changes that are going to be coming along at more frequent intervals. And these mass disruptions are only going to be faster and faster. But education isn't simply to help us prepare for a job or a career. In our lives, we're going to be faced with decisions and circumstances that call for critical thinking and ethical decision-making, that call for discernment of what makes our communities and our families and our lives worth living and supporting. And we can't get that from just sort of narrow vocational training or what our employees want to tell us. Look, we've had this model before, Brian, where our religion or our employers tell us what to do. And I don't think it's really done very well for us. Let me tell you about something that I know we aren't talking a lot about research, but there are two social psychologists, which is my training, Kahneman and Tversky, and they gave us this concept of thinking fast and slow. And I think we're dealing with the availability heuristic here, that sometimes when we see something or hear something, it's very available to us. So and more available than any of the data that's out there. So we each could, I bet everybody in this webinar can talk about some difficult or boring period of time we had in our formal education. You know, bad teachers, boring content, whatever. But there are also moments of just wonderful clarity and really learning. We can't make decisions based on this heuristic, this shortcut thinking that because one of us might have had a less than perfect experience, we should throw out all mass participant institutions. So let's start with this argument that universities should only be for those who are brilliant and curious. I love that term because, boy, is it going to be hard to figure out who those people are, and the rest of us should pursue vocational education. You know, as I said, I think we've lived this scheme before. I'm the daughter of an Italian immigrant. We were hardly elites. But the world that you paint would have had all of us in my family just getting vocational education. My father left the workforce when he was in the educational system when he was in 4th grade. He was both brilliant and curious. He was one of the smartest people that I know. He never had the chance to move forward. He worked at a factory his whole life. He did very well, but he was stymied, and there were times that I saw that just wearing on him. We have millions of young and older people who are brilliant and curious, but they're going to miss the chance to gain advanced learning because they're living in the world where right now the middle class is vanishing. And we again have millions and even billions of people who are trying to survive during COVID. We can't just allow those who are brilliant and curious, because you know what? The parents of most of us who have become middle or upper class are going to be the ones who are continuing to get those kids in those universities. It won't be the brilliant and curious who are less endowed. I suppose if you lived in Silicon Valley in the US, obviously I'm coming from a very American-centric kind of educational system, and you have a penchant for coding and you could be picked up by a company that will pay you more than a living wage, you might do very well with just vocational education. But there's been research done by the American Association of Colleges and Universities that found that in a study of career outcomes, liberal arts graduates over their career actually reach and then supersede those with just a lower level of, say, vocational training. So I don't think that research really follows up on and supports this idea that everybody else should just go and be vocational. You really do need these other skills. What a particular area for me that's very important is the plight of rural communities, both in the US and obviously in the countries where you live. What do you do if you live in a rural county and you have few skills, you don't have a lot of employers? Even there, are you going to go find a job? I don't think so. There aren't any jobs. So this employer first solution really falls down as employers are not really investing in their employees. And second, Brian, the other thing I'd like to point out is that you really have been saying, well, I'm not going to look at research. We're not going to look at research. And yet you did kind of fall back on a little bit of research. Fair enough. It's kind of a case study approach. Again, I would ask that we look at institutions that are actually doing really interesting things. Look at Arizona State University. They are a mass participant university. They are bigger than they've ever been. They are serving a broad group of students online, face-to-face, across the country and the world. Large systems like in Pennsylvania, even though each institution is having a tough time as a mass participant institution, they're coming together as systems, they're merging, and they're trying to serve learners in far better ways. Now, as I said, this is a very US-centric viewpoint, but I would say that that term that is important to me is in their current form. And we can't assume that all universities are stuck in some 20 or 30-year-old model. Many are evolving, many are becoming far more open to a broader type of learning, certificates, online, experiential. And you're going to see those because they have more resources. They're going to be able to do more for their students than, say, smaller, more elite institutions. So don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think that large mass participant institutions are here to stay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie. And thank you for the excellent timekeeping. And we move straight over to Jane, who is backing up the opposing side. Over to you, Jane.
Jane, we need.
I apologize. First of all, I'd like to thank Brian for setting this up. I think we've been talking about this since the spring, so I'm glad we finally come to it. First, I want to oppose the motion, but I would like to challenge some of the assumptions that appeared in there's quite a long description of the topic for this debate, not just the motion. And I'd like to challenge some of the things that were said there, as well as in the comments today from Brian and Marie. First of all, I would like to say that I see an assumption that the in-person experience needs to be replaced with all online instruction, and that's happening now in many places in 2020 due to COVID-related circumstances. People are finding that less than satisfactory for a number of reasons. I am a proponent of online learning. I have an advanced degree in it, and for 15 years, my primary work role was evaluating and advocating for the use of educational technologies and alternative approaches to traditional instruction. My introduction to and subsequent interest in support for online learning came from my own graduate level courses. I submit that in addition to the quality of coursework, regardless of delivery mechanism, there is value, particularly for young people, to what we here call the university experience, enhanced by interacting and living at least for part of the time in the residential university setting with other humans in a physical space, sharing the pursuit of new learning. I would point out that we are right now gathered at an event targeted at online learning practitioners and enthusiasts. And while this format, this virtual format, allows us to have additional participants, many of us still wish we could be together in person. The assumption that the only point of university education is as the means to employment and should therefore be replaced with vocational training brings with it a disregard for its less tangible benefits. Mr. Mulligan and I have sparred about this for years, mostly in good-naturedly. And we've talked about things like whether the university experience produces a person with nebulous traits, such as I think Brian's earlier one was that we're more well-rounded. But in fact, there is some research and some credible research that's shown ways of measuring some non-monetary and tangible benefits of higher academic education. Those with higher education levels tend to be healthier, as do their children, and they tend to live longer and see lower infant mortality. They're more likely to have longer marriages. They're more likely to pursue leisure pursuits and hobbies. They exhibit a bit more social cohesion. They're less prejudiced. They're more likely to donate their money and time. They tend to make more deliberate choices when voting, and they participate in more community organizations. And what I think is a tiny bit of irony, research shows that higher education levels correlate with technology adoption. The lesser known aspects of those outcomes are how much and in what ways the in-person university experience, including time spent outside of coursework proper, influences them. And while vocational training may indeed prepare a person to enact a particular work role, those with university educations experience more employment flexibility. And you heard from Brian, he was able to go from engineering to a completely different pursuit fairly easily. I push back against the idea that university education should be reserved for some elite group of knowledge makers and thinkers. It's not lost on me that the debate participants today are all educated middle-aged white people discussing whether others should be denied access to the same experiences we have. To deny anyone with a desire to learn the chance to experience coursework in the humanities, for instance, like art, literature, history, and the like, it denies them a rich way of experiencing the world. I noticed in the marketing blurbs we submitted for this event that Donald chose to quote Roger Schenck, who I know and like, and I believe Donald mentioned him again a few minutes ago. I thought I would quote him as well. In a recent tweet, Schenck said, "OMG, what will happen if students don't learn art history?" Well, while the world will no doubt keep turning, I think it's a better place with art in it and people who understand and can interpret art across the ages, even if they don't plan to become museum curators, which I feel the world also needs. People with that understanding might bring their knowledge to bear on any number of professions, including our own, so replete with designers as it is. To a more pragmatic point, the real world of work, and Marie mentioned this too, it does for now often demand possession of a degree, and denying access to that will only further limit opportunities, particularly for women and minorities. The sometimes noted view that anyone wanting such other knowledge can just learn it on their own, which I've been told about myself, you could have learned to write anyway, Jane, is dismissive and unrealistic. We are not all created equal self-directed learners. I'm certainly motivated and interested in learning, and I engaged in nearly 10 years of part-time graduate work with no promise of any increase in salary because I felt I needed structure and guidance for it. Finally, to borrow a phrase we've used already, we need to take a careful look before we throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just completing a list of online vocational courses is not the same as experiencing a broad, robust shared experience. Reserving non-vocational learning experiences only for the egg-headed few diminishes opportunities for others and a richer world for us. I feel that far from limiting those opportunities, we need to look at expanding them. A favorite blogger of mine is software developer Joel Spolsky, who a few years back wrote a post that stuck with me about the problems caused when software companies decide to rewrite code from scratch. Netscape and Quattro Pro tried that with disastrous results. Spolsky notes that it's harder to read code than to write it. Different features exist and don't for a reason. Different people like different things. Bugs have been found and fixed. While I don't disagree that the current state of university education has problems, I share a key point from Spolsky. It's important to remember that when you start from scratch, there's absolutely no reason to believe that you're going to do a better job of it next time, which we're seeing now in education's response to the events of 2020. I suggest we give long, hard thought to what it is we want to improve and for whom before declaring the existing education system unsustainable. I am in favor of increased vocational training and other alternatives. And I'm also in favor of finding ways to expand opportunities for those wishing to reap the benefits of the university experience, rather than throw away the improvements to the lives of individuals and society that those benefits can afford. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane, and excellent timekeeping as well. And now we come to the last participant, and that is Donald Clark supporting the motion. Over to you, Donald.
Thank you, Paul. Marie mentioned her father, and I didn't plan this, but I'd like to mention my mother and my sister. My mother and sister were both nurses, and they had hard lives, and they wouldn't be nurses in this day and age. The reason for this is that in the UK, nursing has become a degree subject. They would had to have gone to university to become nurses. What has actually happened, and we have a 40,000 shortage of nurses in the UK as we speak, what has actually happened is that the university system has meant that working class women like my mother and my sister could no longer get jobs in those areas, which I think is a moral disgrace. In other words, higher education has increased inequalities and excluded working class people. It hasn't led to social mobility. A second personal story I'd like to tell is about my kids. I had twin boys, Callum and Carl. That's them there when they were about 3. One went to university. They were twins, remember? It's like living with a sort of, a genetic experiment. One went to college, university, did a degree in artificial intelligence, was brilliant at maths, greatly benefited from that. The other didn't, hated school, and it would have been a disaster for him going to university, sitting in lectures. What he ended up doing was he's smart as his brother, certainly, more socially smart. He started a business. He's doing well. During COVID, he was employing graduates. So what my appeal is for you, and this important word here, is a rebalance of the system away from this is good and this is bad. It's almost like a religious imperative, going back to the sort of Catholic age of indulgences, where you've got to pay for this piece of paper. And if you don't get that degree, you're damned to hell, you know, the hell of low status and precarious employment. Actually, what we're calling for here in the motion is a sort of reformation of the system, a rebalancing. And my second argument would be political. You know, Jane mentioned the rural communities. Have you looked around you in the US and seen what's happened here in terms of this division in society between a graduate class? We've seen Trump, we've seen Brexit in the UK, we've seen the Gilets jaunes burning Paris down in France. When you set up two groups of people, a graduate urban professional class who look down on other people, and let's not forget that the deplorables is what they were called, and similarly with people who voted Brexit here in the UK, this creates deep political divisions, deep class divisions. While one side benefits massively, remember there's always a counterpoint, the people who don't see a future for their kids because all the money is spent on the graduate class. So we need to rebalance the inequalities in society and so try and unite this divided society rather than continuing to divide it along educational grounds and still looking down on people because they didn't go to university. My third argument is really economic. And, you know, the bottom line here is, and I tip my hat to Germany, Austria, Switzerland, the strongest economies in Europe. I wonder why, because they haven't fallen into this trap of having the university as the only system for the young people. They have got strong vocational streams, unlike many other countries, the US and including the UK. And remember that universities don't drive economic growth. They have this idea that you will not grow an economy unless you have a strong university system was certainly not true in Taiwan, South Korea, or even China. All of those countries grew in the absence of a university infrastructure. So the importance of vocational skills was well shown in those countries. We have enough graduate baristas, thank you very much. I think maybe a rethinking around the point that Brian Kaplan made at Online Education, which was 80% of this is signaling. And if we're spending 80% of the cash on signaling, as opposed to healthcare for the poor, or the 10,000 people who are homeless in Los Angeles, or the thousands of people who are homeless in their cities in Europe, then I think we need a rethink here. And remember the cost. It's a staggering $1.67 trillion debt at the federal level on student loans. And don't think that forgiving student loans is the answer. In actual fact, if you have full cancellation of loans, what happens is that top 20% pocket about 192 billion. What it does is feed money into the already wealthy. The bottom lose out once again on those so-called liberal policies. So again, we need to rebalance the system economically for growth and prosperity. And my fourth argument is pedagogy. We're still, I teach in universities all around the world. It's still the 1-hour lecture because the Sumerians had a base 60 number system, nothing to do with psychology learning. It's still the essay. You can go and buy an essay in any university for about $200, a master's dissertation for $1,000 freshly written. The system is fossilized. It's got sclerotic. And what happened? The emperor had no clothes. When COVID came around, what actually happened, Jane, in this rush to the University of Zoom, is exactly what you should not do in online learning. We've had decades of good practice, and what did we do? We ignored it all. This is online educa, folks. We should have done better. So we need to rebalance towards online delivery. All courses should be blended learning. I'm not saying they should all be completely online, but certainly digital by default. And then lastly, I'll make a point about the cultural imbalances that the university system has fraught or imposed upon us here. In Jonathan Haidt's excellent book, The Coddling of the American Mind, he goes through a litany of cases of academics being cancelled. We had this really unedifying spectacle of junior employees of a global publisher, Random House Penguin, who recently burst into tears, crying their little eyes out when they heard that their employer was publishing a book by Jordan Peterson. Now, my mother raised me in a world where crying when you couldn't get your own way was abandoned when you came out of diapers, really, not the norm whenever a colleague thought differently from you. It's surely a sign that universities have lost their way when it produces such graduates who are not resilient in the real world, where debate is being cancelled, where diversity of thought is no longer respected. We're in this online educa, but how many of us didn't go to university? Almost everyone listening to this and all of us participating did. And this is a problem. We've produced a graduate class that speaks to itself. We're in a bubble conference for graduates, within a graduate bubble, talking about graduate bubbles. But this debate is not about us. It's not. It's about everyone else who didn't and doesn't go to university. So this is online educa. Let's pedagogically rebalance towards vocational, towards online, towards blended learning to prevent further political schisms, social unrest, economic, pedagogic fossilization and cultural damage. So I'm with my friend Brian here, a Scotsman and an Irish, us Celts together, and I recommend this motion to the House. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Donald. You could obviously see I'd unmuted myself, so I didn't have to use the wagging finger as the Scottish rhetoric began to take over. So thank you all for your excellent contributions. I'm giving the presenters and the audience advance warning that the poll will open at 15 minutes to the hour, which is basically in about 11 minutes from now. But as I say, the votes will continue to accrete in a kind of pseudo postal system up to 5 minutes to the hour, at which point we will reveal the overall vote calculations. So now the debate is thrown open to the floor. Now it's not quite as knockabout as it would be in the the former debates. So what we do is we abstract from the questions on the floor and kind of portmanteau them and use chair's discretion. So I'm just looking at what's coming in. I've got the raw feed open as well, although not the raw video because that would cause too much disruption. So abstracting from the first question that came in as an actual question, I think what's behind the question here is bit of a lack of numbers. So, you know, given these curious and the elite and the rest of it, how many do we need? And this applies to anyone to answer this, because there's always how many do we need, and how do we know? He uses the phrase researchers pur sang, which I guess means kind of pure-blooded or something. Anyway, you know, in other words, these so-called real researchers, as opposed to these mere engineers like Brian has admitted he was or is. Lack of numbers generally. So, Donald.
Yeah, I don't think we should put a number on this, but in my lifetime, so that's a quite short period in the history of universities if you take them back to, you know, the 12 and 1300s at Bologna. In my lifetime, when I went to university, roughly just over 10% of young people went. In actual fact, people misunderstand the numbers, I think, about university. In the United States, for example, 2/3 of people, if you walk out in the street, 2/3 of them never went to a university or college. The vast majority of people don't. But I think the number certainly should be much smaller, but it's a matter of replacing education with these other options in life, like the one my son took. I think you should be encouraging, not back to a number, but 10% seems reasonable. That's what we had in a period when the economies were growing and we didn't have these social divisions to the same degree. I think there was a sense of that social mobility was a reasonable goal. I think social mobility for my family, working class people, has been almost abandoned, which is why the majority of people in this country voted Brexit. They felt they had no hope in this current system that puts 30 billion into the Erasmus scheme, but nothing for their kids.
It's about the number side, and then from which you may or may not, like Donald, draw some conclusions, implausible or not. So what about the number side? And someone else has asked a question which essentially is about the escalator. So we've solved the problems in the northern world, because someone else has said, well, this is all very well, but this is a northern world perspective. There are some countries who'd love to get to 30% participation in HE. And that's going to cost untold trillions more. So I think let's start with the kind of you know, escalator issue. I mean, if we've got universities, and now we're going to probably move towards master's universities. And I've seen strange signals in North America where in non-research jobs in universities, it's regarded as de facto requirement that you must have a PhD as well as being a competent administrator and manager. So, you know, what about the future? Is this just an everlasting escalator going up and up with more qualifications? What price the qualification after the PhD?
Well, could I comment on that?
Sure.
One thing is, possibly, because I've never quite understood this preoccupation with moving upwards. And it's been quite a while since it's been identified that in a dynamic economic or a dynamic environment, it's best to have people who are broadly qualified than deeply qualified. So it's better for people when they want to continue their education to move sideways into linked areas or to other areas that will add it. And this is not really, doesn't really fit with the whole master's PhD approach, which is really for, I think, as Jane said, the eggheads. But the vast majority of us should be moving sideways to learn new skills that we can add to our existing skills. And to some extent, the MOOC movement is maybe supporting that idea, because a lot of the courses that are available as MOOCs are essentially vocational, and yet some of them call themselves micromasters. It's probably a rather grand name for them, you know, when they're actually vocational. And this may be exactly where we need to be going rather than upwards. But that, I mean, to answer the question is, yes, there will be an escalation of needing more and more skills, but not necessarily at a higher and higher level.
Would the other side like to hazard thoughts on that one?
Well, I go back to the question of what we're debating here is this House believes that universities in their current form are unsustainable as mass participant institutions. And again, it just feels as though we are attacking things that have happened. For example, healthcare and the healthcare institutions have really, you can't just be a nurse in this country either easily as just an RN anymore. You need to get your BSN. We shouldn't blame the universities solely for that. Where we're talking about 10 universities as they exist, serving a mass group of people, be helpful to that large group of people. And I believe the answer is still yes, because universities are evolving. And look, most people are not going to get a PhD. The numbers of people in the US who get a PhD are probably like 2 or 3%. I don't know how many people should get a PhD or become a researcher, but I do know if we go to, Brian's initial idea where we keep universities for the elites, we're going to lose out on some of the smartest and the best people who just can't access it, even if you agree that that's correct. I would say that by actually giving everybody else vocational training and just keeping universities for those who only want to get a PhD, you're actually going to be exacerbating this split in our country. And I think there are many, many reasons why there is this split and there's social unrest. Education might actually be again, more of a correlation than a causation. But it's not the question that we are talking about. And again, there are large institutions that are doing a great job being a mass participant institution that have enough resources to really help their students. Jane, do you?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sure. I think we'll move on because some questions now. You've got people excited now. There's a question here from Joel, and then there's another question. In fact, they're pouring in now. I'm losing track of them. Basically, I think the 2 or 3 questions are talking really about the dichotomy, and is there a dichotomy? So already we've talked about micro-credentials. We're not sure whether they're vocational or educational. People are saying, what about lifelong learning? Who's going to do that? Which side of the divide is that? It seems to be an either or, that's the last thing is basically, what about the length of the whole thing? The whole point about micro-credentials is that you seem to get some, if it's a micro-master's, then you've somehow got some mystical master's experience after a few weeks. So when does this, I guess the question behind their questions is, when does this university magic cut in? And I'm going to kind of signal a view about Scotland. There's a remarkable experiment which has gone on in the United Kingdom for many years, and that is that in north of a border, the border, as some would say, there's a 4-year university system. South of the border and east and west of the border, there's a 3-year university system. And in my experience as an employer and talking to employers, the outputs of these systems are regarded as identical. And yet one seems to save a quarter of the expenditure. And this is probably the most unanalyzed experiment in the history of higher education. And, this kind of thing gets the Canadians particularly excited, I notice, if you try and talk about that. So where is this magic of universities cutting in? And what about things which are what the Germans would call vocational higher education? So that's enough questions for everybody, I think. Donald, yes.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to the word that's Marie, I think, mentioned it first of all, and that's lifelong learning. Lifelong learning has literally nothing to do with universities. Hardly anybody, even those who went to university, go back. It's too expensive. They don't want that student experience, drinking till you barf. Who wants to do that again? Nobody does that. And in practice, empirically, hardly anybody does go back. It's never been the solution. And there's a very good book in this called Janesville, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who goes to a Midwest town, that's in Michigan, after the GM factory closes. And the people hate this idea of them being recommended to go back to college because they can't afford it. They have mortgages, they have kids. It's a lunacy, a lunatic idea. It's actually an educational conceit that everybody should come to us for answers in their life. University has never and never will solve the problem of retraining in economies or lifelong learning. Most of us do it and then never go back. Empirically, that's just a fact and will always be the case.
Thanks, Donald. I'm going to stop the debate just momentarily to do an admin matter. I'd like to announce that the poll is open, and can I have confirmation from the system, otherwise known as Hannah, that the poll is really open? And
Vote early and often.
Vote early. We leave the often to lawyers. But vote early, in fact, is not early, as they say in some states. It's actually just at the right time to start voting now. And I can see that no one has voted yet, so they're obviously still making up their minds. So I'll assume the vote is happening now. Yes, yes. No, still no vote. It just says there's 9 minutes left for the poll. Okay, well, that's up to the audience. Carrying on with the debate, this kind of Donald's given a tilt against the lifelong learning. But I mean, there are people on both sides who come from or came from very non-standard institutions. Marie, you've been very quiet about some of your background, a very different kind of institution which tried to bend the mold, if not break it.
Oh, absolutely. I was trying to give my colleague Jane an opportunity there, but yeah, look, I think it is a disservice to large mass participant institutions to think of them all as just the traditional 4 years with students drinking and to the moment that they barf. In fact, at I'll talk about UMGC and most of the institutions that I worked on, we were helpful to adult learners who were finishing their degrees, who were coming back for certificates, yes, for master's programs, et cetera. We really built the model so that they didn't have to go back on the traditional campus. Again, there's a lot of evolving that is going on among large institutions, a lot of online education. And whether or not lifelong learning is occurring, we have to pivot to a time period and a methodology by which people can learn episodically over time. I think there's room for a lot of different kinds of learning providers, but large mass participant universities are getting into that game and will have a role to play.
Okay, thank you, Marie. I'd like to come to Jane now. I'm perhaps picking up on this kind of skills divide, and also reflecting on her own experience. Who maybe within the parameters, universities to be told to stop interfering in other people's business, and we get quite a lot of that in the UK, trying to do what the colleges are doing perfectly well. Jane, who should be doing this skill stuff, and when does it magically change into education?
One of the things that's interesting is I also attended a British university. I attended American and British universities. And to a point Donald was making, we have something here called the community college, and it's usually a 2-year associate degree. In the state where I live in the state of North Carolina, we have 100 counties. I believe there's almost 100 campuses of this. So it's not necessarily residential. It is local, and people can continue to live at home, especially like right after high school, what we call the 12th grade here. And it's very cheap. I went back before I went to graduate school. I needed to catch up on a statistics course I didn't get when I was an undergraduate. I think it was $150 for me to take that. And so that is affordable, and it is available in rural areas. But the thing is, it's not only vocational. There is a crossover there to other things. So a student who is taking something like nursing or something like statistics can also have some experience and dip a toe perhaps in some of the more esoteric things. So I'm not answering your question very well. I again go back to my original point that I question whether the university's purpose is to just train people to go do a job. I think that there are ways of doing that. I think that there are plenty of avenues for it. Perhaps we can offer support for that, but I don't know that I see that that is the Academy's role. That's why it's called the Academy. One thing that is missing from this conversation, and it might be another debate somewhere, perhaps at another event, is I think we're giving way too much weight and influence of the university over employment decisions that are often a problem that I saw when I was working in human resources offices. You know, this arbitrary demand for a degree for every job, even I don't agree with that. But figuring out what jobs are benefit from that, figuring out what other credentials might work and what might be better for a person who's already set on pursuing a particular course, I think would be worth discussing, but it's not necessarily that the Academy drove things like people having to have a PhD. I have seen firsthand HR offices scrambling to figure out what job requirements are, and they just make stuff up. And often it is something like a degree that maybe is or isn't relevant to work.
Okay, right. I think we've got time for just one or two more. Some people are saying, Louise has said, you know, glad that we're focusing on skills rather than education. There's a question about personalization, which we haven't flagged. I mean, again, within the way, maybe the real problem is the problem of the course, not the lecturers. We often think, is it the course? If we had personalized learning, couldn't we have some kind of continuum between Donald or Brian studying on their own and you know, me sitting in a 200 seat classroom learning differential calculus? You know, there must be you know, points in between, but personalized is, you know, it doesn't have to be random. I mean, where are we sitting on personalized learning now? I'll take two answers, one from each side. I think I'm gonna let the proposers have the very last word. So I think it's fair to have one of Jane and Marie.
So I don't, if I might, let me just jump in. I don't make as strong of a differentiation between skills and education. I believe that we actually do a disservice when we try to split those out as strongly as we seem to. Personalized learning, there's a lot of technology that can help us. We're not very sophisticated yet. We hopefully will be in the future. But what's more important is that individuals understand where they need, what they need to do to get what they need at specific times in their life. And there will always be times. When I was in college and university, there were other things that I was reading. I wasn't learning only very sophisticated yet. We hopefully will be in the future. What's more important is that individuals understand where they need, what they need to do. Anyway, I'll finish by saying it really has to do with universities are good at putting together the type of knowledge set and curriculum that pushes people to think in different ways. It doesn't happen all the time, but that's what can be and should be happening. And you can't just do that on your own. Self-directed learning is much rarer than we think in terms of a really strong way to be thinking critically, et cetera.
Right. Can I add to that quickly? And it will be quick. I would just like to say that we've talked a lot about skills. We haven't really defined what we mean by that. I mean, we're looking at an era where we need many, many more knowledge workers than people who can assemble a car. And to Don's point about rural areas, and I am surrounded by them here in the South, the American South. You know, we are in a situation where sometimes the divide with the rural urban is that the rural areas have lost much of the things that kept them employed. We don't have textile mills. We don't have some of the manufacturing facilities. We don't have some of the labor that perhaps was skilled, but it's been outsourced, it's gone global, or we just don't do that. And we don't have as many retail stores anymore. So figuring out, you know, how, again, we are defining skills and how we are developing what we are developing, I think is an important thing to consider, because it's not just a matter of vocational used to sort of mean trades to me, assembling a car, you know, car repair, carpentry, those kinds of things. And we need to look past sort of trades work as to what, when we talk about needing all these knowledge workers, what kind of knowledge they're going to need and how they're going to get it.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to leave the last word to the proposer of the motion. I have to say there's some really good questions coming in now. I think one moral for these debates is possibly in the online mode an hour isn't enough, because there's really good, really insightful stuff coming in now from Lars and others. So between Brian and Donald, who would like to have the last word for now? I think Donald has been
Donald
elected.
wants to say something there. Go ahead, Donald.
I'll end with two things. First, a response to Jane's point there about skills. That bunch of very smart graduates who went into Wall Street actually exported all of those skills and needs and money to China, which is why you got Trump. You know, this was caused, the financial crisis was caused by smart graduates, supposedly the best, who went into that system, and we're all suffering still from it. But to go back to a personalization issue, which was Paul's last question, I've been heavily involved investing and building personalized learning systems, and Maria's right, one of the real bright spots is Arizona State University. They liked the platform so much they actually invested $1 million in it. It's unknown for universities to do this with technology, and so it does work. But it's nothing. Higher education is doing almost nothing in personalized learning. I give lectures in universities all over the world. I am asked to give a standard lecture, the 1 hour in the lecture room with an array of kids in a room. That's it, folks. That's the core pedagogy. There are little pools of activity. Compare that to the personalized learning that's happening in the workplace with the learning experience platforms, performance support. It's nothing. Absolutely nothing. The universities aren't on the map on personalization. So let's not give false gods or false idols here about the universities will suddenly adapt towards personalization and all will be well. They will crush it because the lecturing is easy, teaching is hard.
Okay, I think that's an interesting point to finish on. I think we're into injury time now, as they'd say in a football match. So I'm going to stop it now. I mean, as I say, it's really good questions coming in. And let's have now a look at the poll. And it says here are the figures at 17:57, so 3 minutes to go. Do you agree or disagree with the House on the motion? This House believes universities in the current form are unsustainable as mass participant institutions, and 66% agree and 34% disagree. So as I think they say in Parliament, the ayes have it. And no doubt there's some demographic issues behind this, but that's, I think, absolutely fascinating and possibly slightly counterintuitive. So I think it remains for me to thank the audience for their questions. As I say, some of them were almost impossible to summarize. They were quite long, as quite often I think they are in this area. And thank our four presenters for coping so well with the quirks of this new debate medium and the multiple windows that one has to. And if the chair's attention was sometimes wandering, it was merely wandering towards another window on his capacious monitor to check what side phenomena were going on. So all credit to you for coping, and that's basically that's it from us. Thank you all very much. The debate is now closed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.